2019 was supposed to be a festive year for me. I was in my second year of college and living in a charming, though slightly worn, bungalow about 15 minutes from campus. It wasn't much, but it was home. I shared it with two roommates, Emma and Lucy, both of whom had left to spend the holidays with their families. That left me alone during the break, but I didn't mind too much. I worked part-time at a diner, and the solitude meant I could enjoy some peace and quiet. Until the night that changed everything. To understand the full story, I need to explain a bit about our living situation. A few months before, we had another roommate, Serena. She had been close to us, at first. But then there was Daryl, her boyfriend. From the moment he started showing up, things went downhill. Daryl wasn't just a visitor. He was a shadow that seemed to linger over our house. At first, it was occasional overnight stays, then full weekends. And soon, he was practically living with us. His presence turned the atmosphere in the house dark. He was moody, unpredictable, and had a short temper that often erupted into shouting matches with Serena. The last straw came one night when Daryl showed up drunk. He banged on our front door, yelling for Serena. When we refused to let him in, he started hurling insults at us through the door. We tried to reason with Serena, begging her to end things with him, but she refused. After a particularly heated confrontation, we told her it was either him or us. To our shock, she chose him and moved out within days, slamming the door on her way out. Before leaving, Serena made an ominous remark that I'd never forgotten. "You think you're safe now? You're not." We didn't know what she meant, but we felt uneasy about it. Daryl knew the layout of our home, our routines, and even where we kept spare keys. For weeks after she left, we triple-checked locks and windows every night. But as time passed, our nerves settled until Christmas Eve. The day had been uneventful. I worked a long shift at the diner and walked home under a light snowfall. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. I locked the front and back doors, checked the windows, and headed to my room. My bedroom was in the back of the house, partially underground with a small window that faced the backyard. Around midnight, I was curled up in bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The stillness of the house was comforting, though the occasional groan of the old wooden floors above was a reminder of its age. I figured the noises were just the house settling. At about 1 a.m., I heard a faint sound from upstairs. It was a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight on the kitchen floor. I paused, my finger hovering over the screen, and strained my ears. Probably the neighbors, I told myself. Their unit was close, and sound carried strangely in these old homes. But then it happened again, a deliberate, drawn-out creak, followed by what sounded like the scrape of a chair being moved. My heart began to race. I put my phone down and listened intently. There it was again. Soft, shuffling footsteps. They moved slowly, purposefully, across the floor above me. I felt my throat tighten as dread crept in. I lived alone now. There shouldn't have been anyone in the house. I debated what to do. Should I call the police? My parents? I dismissed the thought quickly. What if it was nothing? I didn't want to make a scene over some imagined noise. Then the footsteps stopped right above my room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I forgot to lock the door? Maybe Serena had come back for something? Or worse, maybe Daryl was here. The handle on my bedroom door turned. The door clicked open slowly. My heart thundered in my chest as the dim light from the hallway spilled into the room. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He wore a dark hoodie pulled tight over his head. My phone screen lit up, casting a faint glow on my face. His head turned toward me, and for a split second, our eyes locked. In that moment, I felt every ounce of my bravery drain away. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. We just stared at each other, me lying frozen in bed, and him standing there like a shadow brought to life. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back, slowly pulling the door closed. I didn't move for several minutes. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. Finally, I grabbed my phone and texted Lisa, a coworker and close friend. "Someone is in my house. I don't know what to do." Her response was instant. "Call the police, now." I dialed 911 with trembling hands. The dispatcher stayed on the line as I whispered what had happened. When she asked if I could unlock the front door for the officers, I refused. I wasn't leaving my room. Minutes later, red and blue lights illuminated my window, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the porch. The officers searched the entire house while I waited outside, shivering on the back porch. They didn't find anyone, but they did discover the back door unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant the intruder either had a key or picked the lock. When they asked if anyone else had access to the house, Daryl's name was the first to come to mind. The officers suggested changing the locks immediately, but my landlord, ever unhelpful, refused to do it. I stayed at Lisa's place for the next few nights, too shaken to be alone. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. If it was Daryl, why didn't he take anything? Why didn't he do anything? Sometimes I wonder if it was Serena sending some kind of twisted message, or maybe it was just a random intruder who got cold feet. Whatever the truth, the experience left a mark. I can't go to bed without checking every lock at least 3 times, and I installed security cameras in every corner of my new place. To the man who stood in my doorway that night, I don't know what you wanted, but I hope we never meet again. I was 13 when it happened, a night that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Riley, and I lived in a small, weathered bungalow on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and the nights were always still. My mother left when I was just a toddler, and since then it had only been my father, Rocky the dog, and me. My dad worked nights as a security guard at a large industrial plant, so he would often leave the house late in the evening and not return until early morning. I was used to being alone. Most nights, I would pass the time by watching TV, reading, or playing video games until I felt myself drift off to sleep. But that night, something was different. It started as a typical evening, with the summer heat still lingering in the air. The power had gone out around 6 that evening, leaving the house dark and quiet. It wasn't uncommon for the power to go out in our neighborhood, but it usually came back within an hour. This time, it didn't. With no TV to distract me, I decided to retreat to my room early and try to read. I grabbed a flashlight, flicked it on, and flipped open my latest comic book. Rocky lay by the door, occasionally lifting his head to glance around, but otherwise content to stay by my side. The silence of the house felt strangely comforting at first. The air grew thick and still, and the darkness seemed to wrap around the house like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old house settling. It wasn't long before my eyelids grew heavy. I set the comic book aside, sighed, and lay down. I pulled the covers over me, trying to drift off, but my thoughts kept racing. The stillness of the night made it impossible to escape the sensation that something was off. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I lay there, my mind started to wander. I thought about how odd it was that my dad hadn't come home yet. Usually, he would send me a text around this time to let me know he was on his way. I grabbed my phone, but there was no message. I looked at the clock. Midnight. Still no word. I closed my eyes, trying to push aside the strange feeling in my gut. Then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. Creak. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, but it was unmistakable. The sound of the front door slowly creaking open. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The house was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't my dad. I knew that for sure. He never opened the front door quietly. His heavy boots and booming voice would always announce his arrival. But this was something else entirely. I held my breath, listening intently. The creaking stopped, then I heard it again. This time, louder. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the wooden floors of the living room. My first thought was that it was my dad returning home early. But then I remembered, my father had always used the back door to come in, and he had his own key. Why would he open the front door this way without any noise? I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, passing the kitchen and into the hallway. They stopped just outside my door. I dared not move, not even an inch. I had no idea who was in the house, but I was certain it wasn't anyone I knew. The door handle jiggled. I held my breath, hoping that whoever it was would leave. But they didn't. The door creaked open just a fraction, enough for me to hear the soft rustle of someone entering the room. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call for help, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was frozen, trapped in that moment of pure terror. All I could do was watch, my eyes wide in the darkness. I saw a figure, tall and slender, move past the doorway, the faint outline of a coat, the faintest hint of a hat. My mind raced. Who could it be? My father never wore a coat like that, and neither did anyone else I knew. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if they knew exactly where they were going. I barely dared to blink, afraid that if I did, I might miss something crucial. The figure turned toward my brother's room, the one next door. I could hear the soft thud of footsteps on the carpet, followed by a door creaking open. There was a brief silence, then the unmistakable sound of drawers being pulled open and cabinets rattling. It sounded as though the intruder was searching for something. I didn't know what to do. Should I shout out? Should I call for help? But I knew that if I did, the person would hear me, and I would be the next target. It didn't make sense. Why hadn't they come straight into my room? Why were they going through my brother's things? Time seemed to stretch out endlessly. I lay there, wide-eyed, shivering under the covers. I could hear the figure moving around in my brother's room, then walking back and forth in the hallway. The floor creaked with each step. Every time they came near my door, I thought they would come inside, but they never did. Minutes felt like hours. My heart raced faster with each passing second. I was sure the person knew I was there. The sounds grew more frantic, footsteps pacing, something heavy being dragged across the floor. The figure was coming closer, the sound of their boots echoing down the hallway. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. Not a single sound. For what felt like an eternity, the house remained eerily still. I couldn't tell if the intruder was still there or if they had left. I didn't dare move. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway, back toward the front door. The handle jiggled again. The door creaked open. Whoever it was leaving. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to think or feel. I waited until I heard the unmistakable sound of the door closing, followed by the faint hum of the night air outside. The silence was deafening. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Slowly, I got out of bed, my legs shaking. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to risk drawing attention to myself. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds, trying to catch a glimpse of the person who had been in my house. But the yard was empty. The street lights outside flickered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows over the driveway. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the shadows shift outside, until my father came home at dawn. I didn't tell him what had happened. He would have brushed it off as a figment of my imagination. And yet, I knew deep down that someone had been in the house. Someone who didn't belong. In the days that followed, I searched for answers. I asked my father, my neighbors, anyone who might have seen something. But no one had. No one knew anything. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing missing from the house. The police couldn't find anything to go on. Years have passed since that night, but I still wonder, who was it? Why did they never come into my room? Why did they stop at my brother's door? What were they looking for? I don't know the answers. But every time the house goes quiet at night and I hear the faintest creak or whisper, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, watching, waiting. And every time I hear footsteps in the dark, I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't stayed still? If I had made a sound, would I have survived? It was a chilly Thursday morning in early spring, the kind where winter's grip hadn't fully loosened. I was living in a quiet little town called Blackridge Hollow, renting a modest house on the edge of a dense forest. The house wasn't much, but I loved its character. Wood-paneled walls, creaky floors, and massive windows that let in the golden morning light. My roommate, Jen, was an early riser and had left hours ago for her shift at the hospital, leaving me to enjoy the rare solitude. The house was isolated, perched on a small hill overlooking the woods, with a long gravel driveway winding through the trees to meet the road. It wasn't unusual to go days without seeing anyone pass by. That morning, I was at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and catching up on emails. The quiet hum of my laptop was the only sound, and the sunlight streaming through the windows almost made me forget the chill outside. I decided to let in even more light, so I moved to the living room and pulled open the blinds. That's when I saw him. At the edge of the backyard, a man stood motionless. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He seemed to be staring at the house, or maybe at me. At first I thought he might be a hiker who'd wandered too far, or maybe a neighbor. Strangers weren't common around here, but Blackridge Hollow was the kind of town where people still waved when they passed by. But this man didn't wave. He didn't call out or give any indication of why he was there. He just stood there. I stepped back from the window, my pulse quickening. After a moment, he began to move. His steps were slow and deliberate as he circled toward the side of the house, disappearing from my view. My stomach tightened. Something about him felt wrong. Grabbing my phone, I quickly called Jen. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did we hire someone to come by the house today? Like a repairman or something?" Jen sounded groggy. "No, not that I know of. Why?" "There's someone outside," I whispered. "He was in the backyard, and now he's..." A sudden knock at the front door made me jump. "He's at the door," I hissed. Jen's tone sharpened. "Don't answer it, call the police." I hung up and crept toward the front window. The man was on the porch now, standing too close to the door. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening. From my vantage point, I could see his car, a rusted blue sedan parked at an odd angle near the end of the driveway. It had no license plates. I backed away from the window and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, her voice calm and measured. I explained the situation, trying to sound composed, though my hands were trembling. She asked me a series of questions: what the man looked like, what he was doing, whether he'd tried to break in. "He was in the backyard earlier, and now he's on the porch," I said. "His car doesn't have plates." "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked," she said. "Officers are on their way." I thanked her and hung up, but her tone left me unsettled. It felt routine, detached, as if she didn't fully grasp the urgency of the situation. I armed the security system, double-checking every lock. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. The knock came again, this time louder. I crept back toward the window. The man was still there, but now he was leaning closer to the door, one hand resting on the frame. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice shaky. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the window where I was peeking out. His face was mostly shadowed by the brim of his cap, but I could see the faint outline of a smile. "No," he said simply. Then he turned and walked back toward his car. Relief flooded over me as I watched him get into the driver's seat. But he didn't leave. The man sat in his car, the engine idling. From the window, I could see him fiddling with something in his lap, maybe a phone or a radio. A distorted male voice echoed faintly from the car, growing louder as he adjusted whatever he was holding. I called 911 again to ask for an update. "We have officers on the way," the dispatcher assured me. "They should be there shortly." Shortly turned into 10 minutes, then 15. The man was still in his car. I moved from window to window, trying to keep an eye on him without being seen. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Suddenly, the sound of a phone vibrating startled me. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, heavy breathing. I froze, gripping the phone tightly. The breathing grew louder, more deliberate, until I couldn't take it anymore. I hung up and immediately called 911 again, my voice shaking as I explained what had just happened. The dispatcher sounded more concerned this time. She told me to stay on the line until the officers arrived. The sirens came minutes later, shattering the oppressive silence. The man's car reversed down the driveway, but he didn't speed away. Instead, he pulled onto the road and drove off at a leisurely pace, as if he hadn't done anything wrong. 2 police cars pulled up just as he was disappearing around the bend. The officers searched the property and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't committed a crime, at least not one they could prove. Before they left, one of the officers handed me a flyer they'd found tucked under the windshield wiper of the man's car. It was for a supposed tree service, but it looked amateurish and fake. He said he was here to give an estimate, the officer said. Seems like a misunderstanding. But I knew better. The house felt different after that. The large windows I once loved now felt like vulnerabilities. Every sound, every shadow set me on edge. 2 days later, I found a note on the back deck. It was written on a torn piece of paper in blocky, uneven handwriting. "See you again soon.